All right. Hi, everyone. I think we have a good quorum, so we can get started. You're here hopefully to hear more about the new program from the NEH, the Archaeological and Ethnographic Field Research Grants. If that's not what you're here for, you're welcome. If you have questions, you can always shoot us an email or give us a phone call at another time. Before we get started, I'll do some introductions of myself and my colleagues who have joined me today to answer your questions. I should make sure that I'm sharing my screen. Yes, I think I am. So I'll start. I'm Chris Thornton. I'm the director of the research division at the NEH. I'm an anthropologist and archaeologist by training. So I'm very excited to roll out this new program, which replaces the old archaeological field research grant program that ran for many years at the NEH. There's a sort of long backstory that we don't need to get into, but basically it was time to reevaluate the program and make it more compliant with federal policies, which of course have changed over the years. And the answer was what you're going to see today, which is an expanded version of that, expanded to include ethnographic field research in addition to archaeological. So I've been at the NEH for about 2 years. Before that, I spent 8 years at the National Geographic Society, overseeing their grant programs. I know many of you today, I know from those years, so thanks for joining. And before that, I taught briefly after getting my PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And I know some of my old profs are on the line too, so thanks for being here too. Let me allow my colleagues to introduce themselves. Lydia Medici, also from the research division. Do you want to start?
Hello, yes, I'm Lydia Medici. I'm a program analyst here at NEH. I've been here for quite some time. I have already been answering some of your questions on email, and I am going to try to answer as many as I can today to do with writing your application.
Great, thanks, Lydia. And I have 2 colleagues from the Office of Grants Management. This is the office that mainly deals with grants on the back end, ensuring compliance with federal policy, but also checking budgets and making sure that everything is running smoothly with a grant. So Peter, Chris, are you there? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, this is Peter Scott. I'm a grant management specialist with the NEH Office of Grant Management, as Chris said, and I've worked with many programs all over the agency, including in research, the Collaborative Research Program and the Scholarly Editions Program, and other in the research. And I've been in the agency quite a long time, and welcome, and we'll be glad to try to answer your questions. Chris Shadow.
Hi, this is Christopher Shadow. I'm also a grant management specialist with the Office of Grant Management. And as Peter and Chris mentioned, we're here to assist you with any questions specifically related to the budget for this program. Thank you.
Great, thank you guys for being here. Great to have backup. So today, as I go through this very short presentation, I'm just trying to cover some key points to make sure that it might stimulate some questions from you. We're expecting that you've had a chance to look over the notice of funding opportunity, or the guidelines, as we used to call them, on the website, or at least look over the website for this program. So a bit further down in my presentation, I'll point you to some of the key areas that if you haven't had a chance yet, you should really take a closer look. While I'm talking, obviously I can't hear any of you, but you'll see in the console, there's a tab that's called something like chat, or chat and questions, or something. It depends on whether you're using the web-based or the app-based. But if you go into that, you can ask questions, just type them in. And Lydia, Chris, and Peter are going to be maintaining that, looking at your questions and trying to answer them in real time. If there's a question for me that they cannot answer, they're going to just jump right in and say, hey, Chris, there's a question from the audience about X, Y, and Z. So I'm sorry we can't do this more like a Zoom call, but with over 100 attendees, you can imagine how that would go. So we're going to try it this way. So go ahead if you have questions as I go along. Now, to jump into it, as I mentioned, this program originally used to be an archaeological grants program, which went on for many years. And what we've done is we've expanded it. And the approach that I've taken here was in consultation with a number of other granting agencies in these fields, and my colleagues, of course, at the NEH. And the feeling was that in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, archaeology and ethnography are methods. They're not treated as separate disciplines. They are methods used to answer research questions in the humanities. And that's kind of the way we've structured this and the way you should approach this program if you're planning to apply for it. Having key research questions that are critical to the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, and using archaeological methods or ethnographic methods to answer them. So with that, why don't I go ahead and dive in? So I know I have at least sort of two types of audience members. One of them are grant officers, people who work for organizations and institutions as experts in helping scholars to get grants. And the Office of Grants Management in particular, and Lydia, my colleague, are great at answering those sorts of questions, which tend to be very technical. But I wanted to highlight a few things that I think grant officers should keep in the back of their mind. And for you researchers and scholars out there, if you haven't reached out to a grant officer yet, you should definitely do so. And you should be aware that these are questions that you should bring to them if you don't quite understand them. So the first thing you need to know is that field research grants go to institutions. They are not individual grants. The NEH, of course, has our fellowship programs of various kinds that go to individuals. These are institutional grants, which means that you must be aligned or affiliated with an institution willing to hold the grant. That generally means you cannot be adjunct, but that depends on the institution. The project director must hold a PhD or the equivalent. Sorry, I'm having screen problems. Let me, what happens if apologies. Thing keeps popping up on my screen and makes it hard for me to see. Okay. The project director must hold a PhD or the equivalent. So this program is not for graduate students. And the project director should be a humanities scholar. I emphasize must be a humanities scholar as written in the notice of funding opportunity. That means that if the project director is in a science discipline or a science department, there should be clear evidence that that person has a PhD in a humanities field. The maximum request is $150,000 for up to 36 months of support. Those would be continuous months, so 3 years worth of support. You cannot ask for more than $75,000 in a 1-year period. That's a prorated thing. So if you're only asking for 6 months, which would be absolutely fine, you'll prorate that $75,000 down to, I guess it's $37,500. Up to $50,000 of the total request may be federal matching funds. These are special funds in the federal government that grant officers know this, but essentially it means that you are planning to raise third-party funds from elsewhere, a donor, another organization, to match the money that the federal government will provide from our special matching funds. These are not in addition to the $150,000, but they can come out of the $150,000. Some people sometimes ask, why would I bother? What would be the benefit? Oftentimes, panelists, so the reviewers that we ask to assess these applications, one of the questions we're asking them is good use of funds. Do they see the outcomes of the project as being a good use of funds? And the funds coming out of matching are treated differently than what we call outright funds, or the funds coming from our congressional allocation. So in essence, if you asked for $100,000 of the outright funds and $50,000 of matching, the panelists in a sense would be assessing or certainly the staff on the interior of the NEH would be assessing you against a $100,000 mark with the 50,000 as a kind of match. So that's a programmatic thing. This is not a policy thing, but it often can look good for an application to show that they're putting an effort to raise matching funds against federal funds. Okay, an interesting rule we've added to this program. If the project director for the application is tenured faculty, then the institution must request at least $20,000 of these third-party matching funds. We did that after consultation with a number of different organizations in both ethnographic and archaeological endeavors who emphasized that these larger grants from the NEH really have a benefit for more junior scholars as part of their tenure package. As opposed to getting a fellowship, which looks good for anyone. So we kind of wanted to make it enticing for the institution to allow non-tenured faculty or non-tenured researchers to be the project director on these grants, to encourage that. So that's why we have that $20,000 requirement for tenured faculty. And the other thing I want grant officers to know is that awards and subawards must go to institutions eligible to receive federal grants, which means they are essentially a 501c3 registered in the United States. Foreign individuals, of course, can receive funds through these grants, but they must receive them as individuals. So for example, in a lot of international field work, you would partner with a foreign institution or university, and you would think, well, we'll subgrant, a third of the grant will go to my colleagues in that country to then pay for, vehicles and labor and whatever else is needed. You can't actually subgrant to a foreign institution. So this is a change from before, and it means that all the grants must go to US or US 501c3 eligible institutions, but foreign entities, foreign individuals, contracting companies, if you're paying for, translators, this sort of thing, is certainly eligible to be paid through these funds. Chris, Peter, Lydia, do you want to add anything to this slide before I move on?
No, that's pretty good.
Okay.
No, I think you covered it all, Chris.
Great. All right, let's jump forward. All right, what do researchers need to know? So many things now. Okay, these grants are designed to cover field expenses and salary replacement for project directors and collaborating scholars. These grants are not designed to fund publication, writing, or publication costs. We have other programs in the NEH, for example, the Collaborative Research Program, that are designed to fund those. We see this program as complementary to many of those more research and writing oriented programs like fellowships, collaborative research. These are very explicitly about field expenses and the salary replacement needed to buy people's time as needed. I will note that we have allowed up to $5,000 per year on these grants to be used for, broadly speaking, conservation or preservation efforts, which can include community education and outreach. Obviously, this is a critically important aspect of fieldwork these days, is the engagement with the community and the feeling that the community is feeling that they're involved and that we're somehow going to give back. And while these are not meant to be conservation or preservation grants, we understand that it's often important for the success of the research program, which is why we've allowed $5,000 to go towards those efforts. And that can be taken very broadly, but of course it should be explained in the application. So your application narrative, when you go to the notice of funding opportunity, you'll see all the different requirements of the narrative. This is essentially the meat of the proposal. This is what the scholar generally focuses on. You really need to lead with clear research questions. This is not a program designed for documentation, preservation, cataloging, or any sort of large-scale data collection for its own sake. We have other programs at the NEH, particularly through our Preservation and Access Division, that are explicitly designed for that kind of work. This is clearly a research grant program, so we need to see really clear research questions. Those questions should have broad significance to the humanities. And that's kind of the crux of the matter, right? The rub, as they say. We often see many good proposals for, let's say, field work, sometimes archival work, that are very specific to a sub-discipline, but they struggle to demonstrate how those questions are going to be of interest outside their sub-discipline. And remember that NEH review panels are interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. So in this program, for example, I'd imagine we'd have a mix of ethnolinguists, ethnomusicologists, archaeologists, classicists, ethnographers, you name it. A whole mix of people would be reviewing these applications, and each of them has an equal voice. So you have to think about how your proposal, how your research questions and the answers that you hope to achieve could inspire somebody outside of your specific discipline. That's very important. Eligible projects must, of course, utilize archaeological and/or ethnographic methods. What those are, or what we imagine those are, is spelled out very clearly in the website and in the notice of funding opportunity. So I encourage you to go and look it up. We've taken what I hope is a fairly broad approach. For example, in archaeological methods, we allow everything from survey and excavation, but also digital scanning, ethnoarchaeological work, anything that can answer an archaeological research question or could answer a classical or an area studies research question through these various methods. So we've tried to be quite broad. If you have questions about whether the method that you're pursuing will be relevant, please feel free to reach out either through the chat box here now, or just send us an email and we can talk to you about it. You have to respect, if you're working internationally, you have to, of course, respect federal sanctions, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, those regulations. If you're working within the US, particularly if you're doing excavation, you, of course, have to factor in many of the restrictions there as well. If you have questions about those, again, feel free to email us, or put something in the chat function. We'll try to address that as we can. And sorry, I've had a pop up again. This is very irritating. Okay. Requests for post-fieldwork study, which can include the analysis of data, collecting the data, preserving data, and then the writing and publication of data, including, for example, archaeological illustration, ethnographic illustration. Those are not supposed to be in this program. There's some wiggle room. You'll see in the notice of funding opportunity, there is an opportunity, for example, you can put into the grant time to analyze the data, that sort of thing. But if we see in the application, and if panelists see in the application, significant time devoted to sitting down with a collection or sitting down with your notes, your recordings, and doing significant analysis and then writing of chapters for a book or an article, that is not allowed in this program. That should be going to either our fellowships program or to our collaborative research program. Things like in archaeology, if you need to do radiocarbon dating or some kind of laboratory analysis of artifacts just excavated in order to answer the research question, that is absolutely fine. That would be a sort of good example of a post-fieldwork activity that is allowed because it's directly answering the research questions based on newly excavated material. But a legacy collection or something like that would not be considered, and we would run that through the panelists, but that's something that we'll be looking at very carefully. Lydia, Peter, Chris, if you have anything to add, feel free.
No, we're good. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. Okay. All right, this is the website. So I hope all of you have been here to at least browse around. If not, please go ahead and take a look. We've tried to put stuff right on the front page to be helpful. You will see on the right side of the page are some of the more important dates for you to consider. In particular, look at this one. We are reading drafts in this program, but there is a due date. So if you would like to submit a draft for us to look at, and all of us on this call might be involved in draft reading, depending on what you send us. It is next week, I believe, August 19th. So if you want to submit a draft, you will go ahead and submit that. There's information in the notice of funding opportunity, and at the end of this, I'll give the email address for you to submit. I always encourage people to submit something. You are never going to be critiqued later on for submitting a draft that wasn't great or that was partial, incomplete. Only the staff will look at these drafts. Reviewers will never know that you've submitted a draft. They won't see them. We won't mention them. So even if you just have kind of the kernel of an idea and you kind of want to run it through us, or you have some questions about the budget and you're not sure what's going to work, feel free to submit something by August 19th, and we will take a look at it, and we will send you back some comments as soon as possible before the deadline. And the deadline is September 30th, which you can see right below it. So you have to submit your application by September 30th, drafts by August 19th. This is also on the website further down. So after you get through all the text that we've written that kind of explains sort of the summary of the program and what we're looking for, there's obviously more details in the notice of funding opportunity, which is here. So you'd go down, look for step 1, and click on that link, and we'll pull up a PDF that you can download to read through the rules and regulations. And this is really, really important. You have to read through that. If you have questions as you read through it, always feel free to reach out. Via email is the easiest these days since we're not in the office. So feel free to reach out, and if you're confused about anything. We understand that federal notice of funding opportunities can be a little difficult for the uninitiated, so don't be shy. We struggle with them too, so we'll do our best to help you through them. And you'll see right below that link is actually how the institution will go ahead and submit an application. So your grant officer at your institution should know how to do that. But if the grant officers have any problems, of course, always reach out and we can help. In the notice of funding opportunity, one thing I wanted to point you all towards are these restrictions. So like with any grant program, we have rules about what you can and cannot do, or what you can and cannot ask for, I should say. Key things that we are not allowing in this program include field schools. That doesn't mean you cannot bring students. Of course, you're highly encouraged to bring students, whether undergraduate or graduate. They can be included in the budget. For example, funds to bring 3 graduate students or 3 undergraduates to the field. You have to explain what those students will be doing, what is their role, their function, but absolutely acceptable to bring students. What we will be looking for and will not be allowed will be funds for formal field schools, where, for example, people are getting course credit, paying for field schools, that sort of thing. Or where the emphasis is not so much on the research, it's really more on the training. Unfortunately, we can't allow that in this program. We don't allow standalone databases. This gets back to what I was saying about this program is not for the collection, documentation, and or preservation of data. That's obviously a part of research, and databases are certainly allowed, but they should be very specifically databases being created to answer specific research questions. This program does not allow funds to attend professional meetings, to create meetings. We have a program in our collaborative research program, a sub-program, I should say, called Convenings. And you should look there if you're interested in creating a seminar or a small conference on the topic. That would be the place to go, would be our collaborative research Convenings program. But this program is so focused on the actual field research costs that we would not allow funds for that sort of meeting. If there are meetings to organize the field season, that's essentially the project director and collaborating scholars getting together. That's certainly allowed. We wouldn't call that a formal meeting per se. Do keep in mind that we will ask panelists whether we think those funds are warranted. In the age of Zoom and Teams, that we've all supposedly gotten very comfortable with this, you would have to sort of justify the needs to all come together in person, because those can be expensive costs. And similar to what I was saying about post-field work, we don't allow things like the inventories of collections, legacy collections of any kind of data. This is really about the production of new data to answer research questions. On that, I would say that does not restrict you in these grants for asking funds to go to an archive sort of complementing the field work you're doing. If that's part of answering the research question is, I need to spend some time in the archive here, or I need to go look at this database and then use it to do new field research. That's the kind of thing I think would be acceptable. We would run that through reviewers to make sure they thought that was warranted. But again, this shouldn't be the focus of the research. It should be sort of complementary to that. So those are the restrictions that should just so you know. And then the other important thing, particularly for researchers, you should always go look at the review criteria. In any notice of funding opportunity, you will always find what are the criteria that will be used to assess my application. When we have our reviewers come as panelists to the NEH, we make sure to read them once again. These are the 5 criteria and the only criteria that you will use to assess the applications. So I've highlighted sort of the key parts of them. They're pretty obvious. I wouldn't say there's anything glaringly bizarre in these criteria, but there's some criteria that you'll note are not here, and that's true for the entire NEH. For example, we often say that need is not a criterion. That is, if you have already secured some funding for your project and you're looking for more funding to round it out, that will never be used as a criterion. We will never say to panelists, oh, well, they already have a grant, so should they be allowed to get another grant? That's not a criterion, and that is not something that we would ever discuss. But one thing that's sort of tangential that I also wanted to raise in looking at sort of the feasibility of the project and what we talk about, the commitment of the project director, et cetera, if you have had previous grants from the NEH in particular, the panelists will be looking to see what has resulted from those previous grants. Certainly the staff look at that, but we will ask the panelists to say, do you think that they've had previous grants that they have fulfilled what they promised in those grants? And there's a part in the application narrative where you would directly address any previous grants you've received and what's resulted from them. So that is part of the criteria. It's slightly tangential, but it is an important thing to keep in mind if you are a previous recipient of any kind of NEH grant. You'll need to address what's come of it. If it's a relatively new grant and you haven't finished it, that's absolutely fine. You would just simply state that. Similarly, if you are currently on a grant, an NEH grant in particular, or technically any federal grant, you have to sort of reveal that. So we know what percentage of your time is already being paid for, so you aren't double dipping in any other way. And my colleagues in grants management, if you have questions about that, can answer those better than I can. But there are ways institutions and grant officers know that if you're a project director on another project, but you want to apply for this program, you are welcome to do so. You should work with your grants officer, who will work with the Office of Grants Management at the NEH to ensure that there's no overlap in your time and your commitments to the NEH. With that, I think that's all I had. At this point, if you have any questions, you should feel free to go to that chat box and start entering your questions. The email you see down here at the bottom, fieldwork@nih.gov, nice and simple. You should feel free to email us at any time. I can't guarantee we'll get back to you at any time, but we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. And any questions you have, any concerns, should absolutely go there. And we will stay on the line a bit longer in case you have other questions? I see questions are coming in. Lydia, Chris, Peter, are there any questions that have come up that you think the group should hear?
I have been copying everyone on my answers.
Great. I see questions, for example, about postdocs. This comes up a lot. Yes, you can put money in for postdocs and even sometimes for grad students. However, you have to be clear on what that person will be doing, why their role is essential to the completion of the project. And in particular, we often, panelists are frequently asked to say, who is filling this position and is he or she the right person to do so? Oftentimes you want to create a postdoc and you don't have a person in mind, which is absolutely fine. You should then explain what are you looking for. So if you get the grant and create a postdoc position, what's the advertisement going to be? What sort of person are you looking for? What skill sets? And what is that person going to be doing on the project? I'm just looking through the questions, see if there's anything that sparks my thinking. Can you apply as a postdoc? That is possible if the institution allows it. That's between you and the institution. Generally speaking, institutions don't allow postdocs. Well, no, they allow postdocs. They won't allow adjuncts usually, but again, it depends on the institution. Please explain the matching funds requirement again. Okay. The only requirement with matching funds has to do if you are tenured faculty. If the project director on the grant is a tenured faculty member. If the project director is a tenured faculty member, then of the total request, whether your request is $50,000 or $150,000, $20,000 of that must be matched by outside funds, meaning, and that's not what we call cost share. That can't be, well, my institution is pitching in, X, Y, and Z towards the project. That doesn't count. It must be a third-party match, meaning that you have raised $20,000 of private money, foundational money, something like that, for the project, and now you're asking the federal government to match that third-party funding. Okay. We don't ask, by the way, for your institutional cost share, and we strongly encourage you not to tell us your institutional cost share, because if you do so, then we have to track your institutional contribution as well as what you're doing with our money and with the third-party money. So generally speaking, in your budget, you should focus on your request to the NEH, how much you're requesting and what is that request, how do you break that down, what are all the different components to that budget, and if you're requesting third-party match funding, you'll have to explain that. But otherwise, we strongly encourage you not to put institutional cost share into your budget. It leads to a number of complications. I'm just again looking through the questions. Sorry, I can't have you all actually speak. Are grant recipients prioritized by their history of having received a prior grant? Oh, you all responded no to that. We definitely do not. I have a 3-year planning budget. Only be 10 recipients, probably want less projects and more time to develop a program. So this says, I read somewhere that there may only be 10 recipients. Does this program want less projects and more time to develop a program? What you see in the notice of funding opportunity on the website, where it says roughly how much money we have for the program and roughly how many grants we expect to award, those are very rough numbers. Our budget for next year isn't even finalized yet by Congress, so who knows? But we sort of estimate how much we think will be contributing. It's around the same amount that we used to, it's a bit more, but about the same amount we used to contribute to the Archaeological Grants Program back when we had it. I don't think we're having a quota. We never approach our grant program saying, well, we definitely have to get 10 projects. I will say that these are larger grants by NEH standards. They're more complicated applications than, say, our fellowship applications. They're multi-year grants, or they can be. They are institutional grants, so they can have overhead and IDC and all kinds of stuff that's indirect costs. So there's certainly more complex, and so generally speaking, the number of applications usually is lower than in our individual grant programs, where we'll get over 1,000 applications every year. And I think because of that, we're not expecting to give as many grants. My budget is obviously somewhat limited. If we get overwhelmed with applications and they're all of incredibly high quality, then comes the horse trading internally, and we try to figure out ways to fund as many as we can. But we're certainly not coming at this with any kind of quota or mark of what we expect to fund, especially because it's the first year. We kind of want to see what comes in, what the quality level is. Oftentimes, if the quality is not what we expect, that usually suggests that what we've explained is not good enough. So there will be a bit of iteration, but hopefully the guidelines that are out there, the notice of funding opportunity, will answer the right questions and steer you on the right path. Yes, if you submit a budget by the draft deadline, you can get feedback on the budget, and I highly encourage that. Budgets are often the most complicated part. If you are a researcher or scholar, you should absolutely be working with your grants officers or whatever grants office is at your institution, because they're really the experts in federal budgets. Federal budgets are very specific things. They're often quite different from other kinds of funding agencies. So I strongly encourage you to work with your grants officer, even just to draft the budget. If you need help before the 19th, feel free to reach out by email, and one of us will try to get back to you with some help on the budgets. Let's see. If you ask for matching funds, does it limit the outright funds? If you ask for matching funds, you are allowed to ask for up to 50,000. That limits the amount of outright funds you could ask for to 100,000, because the total request, the maximum total request you can ask for is 150,000 in whatever combination of outright funding or matching funding, with a maximum of 50,000 for matching funding. That would be over 150,000 would be over 3 years. So, and remember, it's $75,000 per year would be the maximum request. So if you're asking for 50,000 of matching, and it's only a 1-year project, or you're only requesting 1 year, then the maximum of outright you could ask for would be 25,000 to make that $75,000 max. Let's see. First-time applicant, is there any example outline of a typical proposal structure? What you'll see in the notice of funding opportunity, if you follow what's called the narrative section, it tries to break down for you the actual sections, and you should subtitle in your application those sections to make sure that you're really answering all of them. If you're really a first-time applicant, advice I always give is to remember that an application is not an essay, it's not a publication. It's a very technical, functional document, and you should think about it in that way. It's essentially an extended outline. We've given you the outline of the different components that we want to see. Your narrative statement should be in that order that we lay out in the notice of funding opportunity, and you should make sure to follow the rules about how much we're looking for. So we try to say in there things like no more than 2 pages, or estimated 2 paragraphs, something like that. So try to follow those guidelines for your narrative statement, and that should help you. And again, your grant officer should be able to help you work through that. How important is it for a project to fit into the NEH areas of interest? In this program, not super important. Certainly, if there's a project that does fit, that's a bonus. But this program was not designed to address those. We have other programs that were designed to address those. We just like to let people know that the NEH has certain areas of interest that it's working towards. And if you can explain how your project fits into one or more of those, it doesn't hurt. But it's certainly, there's no thumb on the scale or requirement that it fits into those areas of interest. There's a question about conservation of archaeological materials. As I mentioned, this program is not for conservation. You should go look at our preservation and access division at the NEH, which has programs that might be more helpful in that regard. If you're doing research, field research, again, you are allowed to ask for up to $5,000 per year towards conservation and or preservation efforts, whatever that might be, shoring up a mud brick wall or working with a community on educational material for language revitalization. It could be anything, but no more than $5,000 per year. My 501c3 has no grant officer. Will this create complications for the application? I think somebody's answering that. Yes. You will have to designate somebody. Does the third-party $2,000 have to be secured by the September deadline? The answer is no. You essentially are making a promise that you can raise $20,000. We will not release the matching funds, those $20,000, until we see that you get that you've come with third-party money. I think the way it's written, and maybe Chris and Peter should respond to this in the questions or just speak up. I think the way it's written is that the first $20,000 must be third-party matching. So I think what that means is that none of the funds will be released unless you have, until you have secured the $20,000. So if you apply in September, we will run that through our review process with a final decision announced in March or April. And then if you are awarded a grant, you then start working with the Office of Grants Management to secure that with I think the first start date is May or June, that's allowed. So I would certainly say you have until April, May, or June to make that third party match. But after that, you're gonna start cutting into your time because you won't be able to get, I believe, any of the funds until you've shown us that third party match. And again, that's only for tenured faculty. If the project director is not tenured faculty, but you ask for matching funds, we can release the outright funds to you, but you will not see the matching funds until you prove it. So for example, if you ask for $100,000 of outright funds and $50,000 of matching for 3 years, and you are not tenured, so you're tenure track or you're a postdoc or something like that, I don't believe, and again, Chris and Peter can address this, but I'm pretty sure the way it's written is because it's not a requirement as it is with tenured faculty, we could release up to $100,000 of the outright funding to you. And then within that 3-year period, once you've raised the $50,000, we would then release the $50,000. If in that period, for example, you only raised $20,000, so you thought you could raise 50, but you actually only raised 20, then we would provide you with the matching 20, but not the matching 50. Okay, so that's sort of the gamble, I guess, you take with asking for matching. As I say, the benefit to matching is matching comes out of a different pot of money, so it's assessed differently. So if you're asking for 150,000, but only 50,000, but 50,000 of it is matching, you're really, in a sense, being treated as a $100,000 application rather than a $150,000 application, if that makes any sense. How will the reviewers determine what counts as a high priority issue in the humanities? That's a great question. This comes down to what we call the broad significance. What does that mean? And I would say it really falls on the applicant to make a convincing case, because of course the reviewers, because it's interdisciplinary, they don't know all the fields. They may not know what you're working on. They may not know your specific subfield in the humanities. So it's up to the applicant to really make a strong case to explain what is the literature, the discourse going on in the professional literature on this topic. What are you addressing within that literature, and why is it new? Why is it interesting? Why is it important? Projects that we fund will not have to sing to every humanities field out there. If it's ethnomusicology of an Indonesian group, that probably isn't going to speak to a classicist naturally, but the classicist may be inspired, might be convinced by the application, and that's what we often see. And so we encourage you to write convincingly, to write clearly. Always in an application, try to avoid jargon as much as possible. Jargon is a killer. Because again, if a classicist is reading an ethnomusicology project and it's full of jargon that's unexplained, that classicist is going to give up real quick and is just going to say, I couldn't make heads or tails of this, and vice versa, by the way. So avoiding jargon is key, and I would really emphasize that it falls on the applicant to make that case, to really make a strong case for the significance. Could the conservation allowance be used for artifact conservation if necessary? Yes, it can. Site conservation, artifact conservation, or any kind of conservation work related to the current research that's being done. Because again, we see that as often important for getting permits. Continued work with communities is the sense that they're getting something out of it. We're not just helicoptering in, getting what we want and then leaving, trying to contribute something. I wish we could do more, but the way that the funding is written is very specific. One question that has come up before is about indirect costs, and this would particularly be for grant officers to know. In general, NEH institutional grants do not fall under research as the indirect cost, even if it's a research grant. Research in indirect costs to the federal government tends to be very specifically about laboratory research. So they tend to be a very high percentage because it's so much overhead in maintaining a laboratory. Almost 95, 99%, and Chris and Peter can speak up if I'm saying this wrong, of the costs that will allow indirect costs on a federal, on this kind of grant, on this kind of research grant, will fall under other sponsored activities. So if you're a grant officer and you're looking at your negotiated rate with the federal government on IDC, you should be looking at other sponsored activities. There's also off-campus, on-campus, which is something you'll also have to look at. If you have questions about that, always reach out. Feel free to email. We'll get back to you as soon as possible on that. What was I going to say about IDC? I forgot now. Let's see. If I will be an assistant professor at the time of the grant start date, should I apply through that institution or my current institution? You should apply through whatever institution is going to manage your grant application now. Grants can always be transferred between institutions. You should obviously, if your current institution is going to be where you're applying from, make sure that they're comfortable transferring the grant. Because remember, the grant is given to the institution, not to the individual. So technically, if you then move to another institution, your first institution could decide to actually give the grant to a different researcher. Now they have to justify that to us to say, well, Jane Smith has left to go somewhere else, but we have Joe Thomas over here who also has a similar background and is was a collaborator on the project and is gonna keep working on it, in which case the grant will stay with the institution. But be very careful about that. Make sure both institutions are comfortable with the idea that you may apply from one and go to the other. If you've already accepted a position at a new institution, my recommendation is talk to them first, if that's where you're going, and see if they're willing to apply now on your behalf. There's all sorts of insurance rules and other kinds of rules they may not be able to, but at least try that first, because that can get a little bit messy. Let me see. My questions are jumping all around. Are indirect included in the 150? Yes, they are. Let's see. What is the rationale for requesting matching funds for tenure faculty? A good question. I mentioned this in the beginning. This was in consultation with a number of different other funding agencies. I spoke with a number of professional organizations in archaeological and ethnographic fields. And I was trying to get a sense of the value of our larger institutional grants for field research. I was trying to understand why, when we have such limited funding for these grants, I mean, $800,000 goes real fast, right? In comparison, the NSF's funding for just archaeological field work is something like 6 or 7 million. So they're giving out 35, 36 grants of this type per year, and we're giving out 4, right, or 5, at least in the past. And so I was trying to figure out what the value was. And what came across loud and clear from a number of people was that for tenure track faculty in particular, or postdocs, people who aren't even on the tenure track yet, one thing on the resume that's often lacking is the lack of, quote, larger grants that allow for paying for postdocs, paying for graduate students, and providing institutional overhead. This is particularly true at non-private universities, small colleges. They want to see that if the faculty member, if the non-tenured faculty member is doing research, that it's benefiting the institution more than just the researcher. And so that came across really loud and clear. And so we've put the $20,000 restriction of matching funds on tenured faculty, essentially as an incentive for the institution to try to put their best foot forward with non-tenured faculty who, in a sense, need these sorts of grants more than the tenured faculty. That said, tenured faculty are generally more senior, have more of an ability to raise funds. They have, in theory, they have more behind them. So I don't think $20,000 is going to be a big ask. We debated the amount and we landed on $20,000 as kind of a, what's the word? Showing that the tenured faculty and the institution are willing to take that extra step to try to match the federal government in funding. But I mean, it's a new thing we're trying, and we'll see how it works. And I apologize if you're tenured faculty and you think this is unfair, but it's sort of how we fell out. If I cannot apply through an institution, so if I'm adjunct, can I bring on a PI who is not actively involved in my work as something of a figurehead? I don't think so. I mean, technically you can if the institution is willing to apply with a so-called figurehead project director. But what's going to happen is the panelists are going to say, it's clear this person is not actually doing anything. And the panelists are going to focus most intensely on the project director, the sole person listed as the project director. If that project director is a figurehead, who's not really invested in the project, I don't think that's going to fly. That's one of the 5 main criteria. So it's always better. The project director should be directly involved in the creation of the research questions and the active work to answer those questions. And again, collaborating scholars. So in other grant programs, you can have multiple project directors. You can have a project director and co-directors, co-PIs. In this, we're looking for the sole project director, and then what we would call collaborating scholars, which are de facto co-PIs, etc. Let's see. Can 2 institutions apply for collaborative work by 2 project directors? What if one is tenured and the other is not? 2 institutions cannot apply for the same project. What happens instead, if they're both eligible institutions, is one institution will apply with the other institution listed as a sub-awardee. And then we're just looking at the institution that's applying. If the project director from one institution is tenured and what would be the project director from the other institution is not tenured, That's up to you to decide which institution should apply. If you go with the institution that has the tenured faculty, then that $20,000 rule applies. If you go with the institution that is a non-tenured faculty, you don't have to do that matching $20,000, even if the collaborating scholar on it is tenured. The point is, if the project director, who's essentially going to get the credit for being awarded the grant on their CV, right? Getting back to why did we put this restriction? If the project director is non-tenured, those restrictions don't apply. There's a question here about it could be awkward to try to raise funds, the $20,000 funds for a project that may not be chosen by the NEH. Do you suggest waiting to know if funded before working with individual donors? That's up to you. I would encourage you to work with your grants office. They will certainly know better than we how that works. I would say that in my limited experience, individual donors are always happy to hear that you're trying to get a larger grant and that you're trying to leverage their funding to get federal funding and vice versa. And so in my limited experience, donors will often say, okay, if you get awarded the NEH grant, I'll throw in $20,000. And foundations are a little trickier because you're applying to foundations, and obviously then there's the issue of, well, if they're both waiting on the other and you don't get one, does the whole thing unravel? You're going to have to check that with the other foundation to see what their rules are. Some foundations, I know when we were at National Geographic, we didn't take that into consideration there, and it was simply you were either awarded or you were not, and if you got the other grant, great. If you didn't get the other grant, so be it. That was on you. But other foundations are not that way. They may want to see that you've been awarded the other grant before they award their grant. I don't know. We at the NEH don't look at that. We will be looking, of course, at the $20,000 if you're a tenured faculty. Let's see. Any other questions? What time are we at? We're at 4:01. Let's see. I don't want to hold people too long, but if you have more questions, now's the time. And again, feel free to email us. We will get back to you as soon as possible. You do send drafts to that email address as well, so fieldwork@nih.gov. If you're going to submit a draft, again, even if it's not fully baked, even if it's just a one-pager with an idea, go ahead and send it. If it's a budget and you kind of want to run the budget through us to say, are these going to be allowable costs? That's absolutely fine. You can certainly do that. You can also just email us and ask questions. That also helps. But yeah, everything should go through fieldwork@nih.gov. We are trying to check our voicemail, but obviously we're not in the office. So the quickest way to get any of us is through email. Let's see. Any other unanswered questions? Let's see. It's funny how many questions are basically about how do I avoid the $20,000 requirement? Come on, people. $20,000, you can do it. I have faith. Okay. All right. I think that's all the questions. So thank you all for joining. Again, email us fieldwork@nih.gov, and we very much look forward to seeing the first round of applications. So thanks for joining us today, and we will talk to all of you very soon. Bye-bye.